China has tripled the size of its spy satellite network at a breathtaking speed, according to commanders from the newly formed US Space Force. They said that Beijing now has around 350 surveillance satellites, which are focused on coverage of the Indo-Pacific region. They said that this satellite constellation growing far faster than anything America is doing, and they warned that these satellites will allow China to find and target US and allied warships in the event of a war with Taiwan. They will also allow Beijing, should it want to hit targets on the island of Taiwan with much greater accuracy than before. Effectively, what they do is they allow military commanders to hit targets beyond the normal range of radars, to hit targets which may not be static, which may also be moving, like warships. And this was a source of great concern to officers from Space Force who I was speaking to at the US Embassy in London. They'd been over in the UK for a conference about the safe management of space. Interestingly, they were very clear. They said that the posture that China was using was demonstrating a clear intent, and that intent was to create what they described as a prohibitive environment for the US and US allies in the Indo-Pacific region. So in layman's speak, that is effectively making it a no-go area for Western and Allied navies like the Royal Navy. Worth remembering, of course, that the Royal Navy sent its carrier strike group into the Indo-Pacific in a symbolic show of force and gesture of defiance when the aircraft carrier HMS Queen Elizabeth made her maiden round-the-world voyage. America fairly regularly sends warships through the Taiwan Strait in an exercise of a freedom of navigation exercise, because those are international waters, but Beijing sees them as its own territorial waters. The use of these satellites is part of a military doctrine known as anti-access area denial, or A2AD, and effectively it is the use of shore-based missile batteries to threaten the arrival of forces by sea or by air. And what we've seen China doing is they've been building bases on coral atolls, on small islands, to expand the reach and the range of their missile batteries. And those batteries have traditionally been accompanied by radar stations, and those radar stations can scan the oceans for often a huge area in order to target with those missiles. But the difference is, of course, is that satellites in space can see a much larger area. And the point that these officers from Space Command were making to me today was that China already has the ballistic missile capability. Its weapons can fire, hundreds, thousands of miles. But the difficulty for those missiles is hitting targets accurately. Now, if you're hitting land-based static targets like airfields or headquarters, then you know where they are and you can pre-program those missiles long in advance. It doesn't necessarily matter if you lose communication with that missile during its journey. It's different if you're trying to hit a warship or an aircraft or some form of enemy force that is mobile, and that's potentially where satellites play a different part.
We've sleptwalked for a number of years into this sort of principle and idea that this wasn't a threat, that it could be managed, it could be dealt with. And I think we always make the mistake of not really understanding what our opponents really want. We tend to see them initially as they're reasonable people. If we just do a deal with them, everyone can get on and can work in that way. And history has shown us time and time again that when you come to an aggressive dictatorship of various kinds, that's a mistake, because they're never satisfied with the bare minimum. What they actually want is a maximalist position. And the Chinese want dominance. That is no doubt. Again, from their perspective, it's perfectly rational. I'm not criticizing them for it. All I'm saying is that we now need to recognize that as a reality and respond as we would to any threat, which is to stand up to it, contain it, make sure it doesn't become an even larger problem, and as a result, safeguard our own position. If we can do that, I'm confident. But right now, I'm concerned we're not taking steps quickly enough to make that happen. It is quite clear that there is no prospect of changing China through being nice to China. Yes, you could, potentially avoid, sort of military conflict. And of course, nobody's looking for military conflict by trying to be nicer for China. But all you ought to essentially be doing is hastening the era of Chinese dominance by doing so. Because the reality is that unless you stand up to this threat, and ultimately it remains a threat, whether it is military or cultural, or if it is economic or just strategic, whatever it is, it remains a threat. If you don't stand up to it, then ultimately it will overwhelm you. We've already had too much of, kind of standing back and letting China do its own thing. Now the period has to be for us to strengthen our resolve, rediscover our purpose collectively, and remind ourselves that the reason the West has been the most successful, if you like, sort of political, cultural, economic, military unit in the world comes from our values. And that's been the basis of everything we've done for the last 300 years. So that remains true, and we have to redouble on that approach. And there's no prospect of that happening if you're too nice to China. I think you can maintain a respectable distance. Obviously, you can say, look, we're happy to trade in general terms, but we have to, you have to understand that we see you now as a threat, given who you are and what you're looking to do to us, and we're going to respond accordingly. So you can live with that in peace, and we can get on with all we do by a policy, if you like, of containment, to use that famous Cold War phrase, where we'll contain you within your imminent region, and you'll have to accept that. Or if you try and break out, we'll have to try and stop you. So it's really that sort of message, that uncompromising message, to say we are going to stand up for what we believe in now, that will be the best guarantee, I think, of preventing China from breaking out into something more violent. The lesson for this is, for the Chinese, is don't be so confident that you could win a war against Taiwan. Yes, your military capabilities on paper completely dwarf the Taiwanese. But what happens if your untested soldiers end up, messing up the amphibious assault? It's a very difficult thing to go over sea to head over there. What happens if you lose the informational battle? Yes, you knock Taiwan's capabilities out from the air or whatever, but you then start to be seen as the aggressor. What happens if the West, bands together and decides to sanction you, and your response is to try and sanction the West? Well, your economy is going to go into free fall as a result of that. There are lots of things that would deter the Chinese, I think. And part of this is about building up the deterrence capability before any such potential conflict, and make the cost of it simply too great for the Chinese to contemplate.